American men home. By December 15, over 60,000 men will have been withdrawn from South Vietnam, including 20% of all of our combat forces. The South Vietnamese have continued to gain in strength. As a result, they've been able to take over combat responsibilities from our American troops. We have adopted a plan which we have worked out in cooperation with the South Vietnamese for the complete withdrawal of all U.S. combat ground forces and their replacement by South Vietnamese forces on an orderly, scheduled timetable.
1969. No longer was this Lyndon Johnson's war. It was Richard Nixon's war, and President Nixon pursued a program called Vietnamization, withdrawing some American troops, turning more of the fighting over to the Army of South Vietnam. But could South Vietnam meet that challenge? When the chips were down, would these troops stand and fight? The United States could give them only part of what they needed: air support, equipment, training. We could not give them motivation or leadership or courage. These would be tested soon enough, and the future of Vietnam would be at stake. Within 6 months of his inauguration, Richard Nixon had announced the first withdrawal of American troops from Vietnam. There were other decisions he did not announce. In March of 1969, he'd begun the secret bombing of communist strongholds in Cambodia. And later that year, Nixon's national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, began a series of secret peace talks with officials of North Vietnam. Already official peace talks were underway in Paris, but only after a 10-week dispute about the shape of the table, who would sit where at the table. The answer was to make it round. Everyone was equal: the United States, South Vietnam, North Vietnam, and the Viet Cong. For the thousands of American troops brought home from Vietnam, a nightmare had ended. For those who remained, the nightmare continued, as Richard Threlkeld reported.
The battle for Bu Dap is supposed to be an all-Vietnamese operation, but it's becoming more Americanized every day. American helicopters and fighter planes raking the North Vietnamese positions that surround the Special Forces camp. And an all-American fire base known as Jerry. The 1st Air Cavalry Division reoccupied this abandoned fire base only 5 days ago. And now, like Bu Dap, Jerry is surrounded and under siege. Now these Americans are racing against time to build new bunkers before enemy artillery zeroes in on Jerry. For some, the race has already been lost. 5 GIs have been killed and 11 wounded here at Jerry today alone. Moving around is done at one's own risk. The operational commander, Lieutenant Colonel Ronald Rasmussen, took the same risk when he paused for a moment to answer a question.
Colonel, what do you think the enemy's intentions are for the Bu Dap area as a result of the last week's action?
Well, I think he has 2 things in mind. First of all, he'd like to upset the pacification program here in this particular district. And secondly, if the opportunity presents itself, he'd like to overrun the district headquarters.
You think the pressure here at...
Keep rolling.
This is exactly the way it's been at Firebase Jerry for the last 24 hours. You never know when that terrible, frightening word, incoming,
On the hill.
is going to start.
He's on the hill.
And there it is.
Run on! Run on!
This time, the enemy gunners were off their mark, and the shells exploded in a momentarily deserted section of the base. Jerry's defenders retaliated by firing their howitzers point-blank into the enemy positions only 30 yards beyond the perimeter. CBS cameraman Pham Boy Juan and soundman Pham Tan Zan repeatedly exposed themselves to enemy fire to film these scenes. A reconnaissance platoon was sent out to find the enemy mortar and ran right into a big enemy bunker. Outmanned and outgunned, the Americans beat a hasty retreat to the relative safety of the barbed wire perimeter, firing back from behind the trenches, World War I style. Helicopter gunships moved in to rocket the enemy bunkers, striking so close that shrapnel fragments whistled over Jerry's own sandbags. Firebase Jerry was reopened to give the South Vietnamese some help, but Jerry's defenders are now spending most of their time defending themselves, and there's a growing suspicion here that it is the Americans, not the South Vietnamese troops, who are the real enemy targets. Most of the Americans at Jerry are newcomers to combat. It's taken only 5 days here to make them veterans.
So that's the way it goes at Firebase Jerry, the newest North Vietnamese target. A few minutes of hard work and a few minutes of hell and fear. You may get used to it, but you never get over it. Richard Threlkeld, CBS News, Firebase Jerry, South Vietnam.
1970 was the second year of the Nixon presidency. It brought a combination of escalation and de-escalation. More American troops were withdrawn, but the president also ordered troops into Cambodia. That touched off new protest demonstrations in the United States, especially on college campuses. One of those demonstrations was at Kent State University in Ohio, and there the protest led to tragedy. National Guardsmen fired on the crowd, and 4 students were killed. Despite the protests, American troops were fighting in Cambodia now, as well as Vietnam. The stated purpose was to destroy the Communist command headquarters in Cambodia and to wipe out enemy sanctuaries. President Nixon described the operation as an incursion. American troops would be withdrawn in 2 months, but South Vietnamese troops would remain. Gary Shepard went along with one American unit as the ground war expanded across the Cambodian border.
Bravo Company's mission is to take Hill 423, a seemingly insignificant piece of terrain 10 miles inside Cambodia. Little did the men realize when they moved out that when they made it to the top, they would have another name for Hill 423. The enemy was waiting when Bravo Company and a reconnaissance platoon from Echo Company began the assault. And it wasn't long before the men were in the midst of bitter fighting. The battle raged on for nearly 4 hours, and before it was over, 6 members of Bravo Company had been wounded. While the rest of the company pressed on to the top of the hill, the wounded were carried to a small jungle clearing, where a helicopter would carry them to a hospital bed in South Vietnam. Specialist 4 Chris Kepelos of Albuquerque, New Mexico, was killed in action during the battle. When the company finally made it to the top of Hill 423, the men decided to name it after him. From then on, it would be known as Shaky's Hill.
John, you were Shaky's best buddy. How did he get the name?
Well, he kind of had a speech impediment, and he always stuttered, so like on the LZ one night, we all got drunk, and that's how he picked it up, Shaky. So they started calling him Shaky all the time, because he stuttered so much.
What was he like?
He was only 19 years old.
Shaky's Hill turned out to be a major communist supply depot. Everything from Chinese communist AK-47 rifles to machine gun bullets and medical supplies. Lieutenant Bob Lewis of Miami, Florida.
Just how large a cache is it?
Well, I feel it's going to be one of the largest ever found, including Vietnam or Cambodia. Reason being, we found, let's see, 29 bunkers, and you can see what comes out of one bunker. I think you've already got pictures of that, and that's, we haven't even touched upon it.
It's hard on all of us. I know we're all tired of this. Tired.
You want to get back to Vietnam?
I never thought I'd be saying that either. I want to go to Vietnam for a change instead of staying in Cambodia.
We're going home. We're going home. This is it. Bravo Company's going home.
After spending 22 consecutive days in the Cambodian jungle, Bravo Company was about to move out. It had been a tough campaign. During the almost daily fighting with North Vietnamese troops, casualties ran above 50%. 4 of the men had been killed and 60 had been wounded. The huge Chinook helicopters arrived by mid-morning, and Bravo Company begins its move out of the jungle. More than half of the enemy bunkers discovered by Bravo Company remain to be opened, so Delta Company is brought in to finish the job. And Bravo heads for Fire Support Base Neil, still inside Cambodia, but at least out of the jungle.
Now that is outstanding.
It doesn't take long before the men find a place to clean up.
Well, hey!
Something they haven't been able to do for a long time.
That's okay, it won't run out.
When was the last time you had a bath?
The last time I had a bath, I can't remember. It's been buku time ago, though.
Feel pretty good?
Great. Feels great.
Were you scared out there?
Scared is an understatement. Everybody was scared, but at the time we didn't realize it so much until it was all over and you think back and then you realize how scared you were.
Did you bring a beer? Everyone must have one. This is hot chow. I don't know how y'all going to react to it, but it is hot chow.
There it is. There it is. Cincinnati.
All right.
There really isn't any end to this story. The few days Bravo Company will spend here at Fire Support Base Neil amount to just a brief intermission in the war. Before long, these men will move back into the jungle and pick up the war where they left it today. Gary Shepard, CBS News, with the U.S. 1st Air Cavalry Division inside Cambodia.
South Vietnamese troops were taking over more of the ground war, but they and American combat troops remained dependent on air support. That included American helicopters, and as the enemy's anti-aircraft weapons became more deadly, the helicopter war became more dangerous. As Morton Dean reported, it took a special type of man and a special type of courage to fly those missions.
His name is Forbes, Chief Warrant Officer Wayne Forbes, and he hails from Galveston, Texas. By anyone's reckoning, he's one of the toughest, most daring, and bravest helicopter pilots in Vietnam. Owner of a Distinguished Flying Cross, a Silver Star, a Bronze Star, and over 50 air medals. He's a hawk, distressed by what he says is a war the government won't let her soldiers win.
He was only 19, just barely a month and a half.
It's Forbes' own composition, a protest song, a call for a stronger U.S. military commitment, a ballad about a 19-year-old boy who is called to war.
It said, boy, you gotta come and take your place, a boy among men, a boy among men.
He is 23 years old now, married, and like the young man in the song, came into the Army at age 19. He volunteered to be a scout. He is now in his second tour in Vietnam and has always been where the action is the hottest. Forbes is a scout with the Air Cavalry, skimming the ground, sometimes low enough to personally deposit a grenade in the small opening of a bunker, performing with a flying machine the job the scouts of the old cavalry used to perform with their horses and on foot, prowling the countryside to seek out the enemy. The scout travels with company, 2 Cobra gunships and another heavily armed helicopter with a rifle platoon aboard. That in the event one of the choppers crashes and a combat team is needed on the ground for security. We've been out with Forbes and his colleagues for 3.5 hours now. They consider it a successful mission, and we're heading back to the helipad at Quang Tri. Forbes is characteristically flamboyant. He has swagger. He's the only man on base with a hand-carved inlaid pool cue. and at times he has been known to rip open a can of beer with his teeth. Some days, today, it's more difficult for him to loosen up. He's trying hard to forget what he has seen only hours before. Forbes was the first man to arrive on a rescue mission to Laos. What he saw was the helicopter of a fellow scout.
I remember for quite some time the pass I made over the people that went down today. Being the first one there, finding them there, realizing there were no survivors. But it's happened before, so it'll probably happen again.
Since the recent buildup, Charlie Horse Troop, 3rd Squadron, 5th Cavalry, has had 9 men killed. Almost every helicopter in the troop has taken fire. 5 have been destroyed. Forbes says he worries a lot about that these days, and at age 23, his hands have begun to tremble, except when he's at the controls of his helicopter, or when he loses himself in the ballad he has written.
He died in some Vietnam scene, just to raise some stuffy politician's prestige. St. Peter said, from Vietnam I can tell, I know you'll go to heaven, son. You served your time in hell.
The Vietnam War, as any war, had its moments of quiet and moments even of humor, punctuated by other moments of desperation and fear. The television series MASH was based on the Korean War, not Vietnam. But sometimes life can imitate art, as Gary Shepard reports.
This is the 18th Surgical Hospital, the last major American medical facility north before you hit the demilitarized zone. Nearly 150 doctors, nurses, medics, and helicopter pilots on call around the clock, 12 miles from the DMZ.
Oh, God.
Okay, what's your rank?
I don't even remember. 02, I guess.
Okay, and your organization? What's your unit?
1 left. Last I heard. What the hell's going on here? Okay, buddy. You're all right, sir. Relax. He's under control.
Inside the emergency room, 2 American soldiers have just been brought in by helicopter from Cam Lo, 20 miles to the northwest, where their 5-ton truck ran over a mine. One of them has only 36 days left before he is scheduled to go home. Both will survive. Fortunately, the truck itself kept most of the shrapnel from penetrating their bodies.
What's hurting you? The neck. Oh. Oh.
Jimmy, let me have the Jack Daniels over here, please.
It is 7 p.m. The flurry of activity in the emergency room has subsided, and most of the doctors finally have time to take a break. Their gathering place is a small hut called Kontiki Porch.
Where do the steaks come from?
Well, friends give it to us, and we give them something else in return.
Why do you eat here instead of at the mess hall?
The food is excellent. We have a good cook, Willie Sanchez. Yeah, I like it very much.
He's the chief of surgery.
He's the chief of surgery and the best meat cutter you've ever seen. If you'll pardon that.
Right, I got 39 units from you people by a chopper about 10 minutes ago. And I'm drawing people up here now for O positive. But I'm completely flat out.
In the emergency room, 24 GIs have responded to an urgent call for blood. A few minutes before, DMZ Dustoff brought in a GI who had both legs blown off by a mine. The soldier is now in the operating room, and the blood these men are donating will be used almost as quickly as it is received.
No, I want to increase it. I need more of it. Right. Because they're ordering 25 units on this guy in the OR now. Single guy. He's had a double amputation.
Betty Corbridge is leaving us and is going back to the States after a year. She really did a great job with the kids, and I know a lot of kids are going to miss her very much, and so are we. Betty? Yeah! They told me when I was elected that I have to kiss all the nurses goodbye. This is part of it.
Captain Marcy Kidd of Fort Walton Beach, Florida, won't get her goodbye kiss for 10 more months. She has been in Vietnam for only 7 weeks.
Is there much to do here at the hospital besides working?
Yes, there is. Surprisingly enough, everybody thinks that all you do is work and then go to bed and then get up in the morning and work again. But at night, we very close. The hospital unit is a real close unit. You work together and you play together. We have parties on Saturdays or Friday nights and steaks out of the club, barbecue, rice, drinks. Just a really good time. Get together, we have a recorder, music, talk, play bridge, you know, just really have fun. When you're not working, it's hard to believe that you're really over here until you walk on the floors and see the patients.
Okay, let's go. Getting going.
In recent months, it hasn't been as busy here as it used to be, with the level of fighting down significantly. But it's busy enough. Sometimes too busy to think about steaks or Jack Daniels or a trip to the PX. Too busy to think about anything except the battle with death. When the medevacs come in, the party's over. Gary Shepard, CBS News, Quang Tri.
Even as the American withdrawal was underway, hundreds of thousands of American fighting men remained in Vietnam. But there's one point to remember. Many of those were not really fighting. Throughout the war, the combat troops were outnumbered by support troops, and life at the rear was significantly different from life at the front. Morley Safer explored that difference in 1970.
This is Long Binh Army Post, 16 miles from Saigon. It's one of the biggest American bases in Vietnam, a city of 26,000 men. One sergeant here told me that being in Long Binh was the next best thing to not being in Vietnam at all. But Long Binh, like the rest of Vietnam, is a combat zone. Everyone gets combat pay. You can spend your year in Vietnam at Long Binh with very little feeling of a war going on. These are the air-conditioned soldiers. They work in dozens of different headquarters and logistics jobs. One colonel, the head of information here, has a staff of 45, 3 of whom put out the headquarters magazine called Uptight. The colonel admits that his 42 other information personnel have very little to do. This is an example of the Parkinsonian principle behind every big bureaucracy, military or civilian. The more support troops there are in Vietnam to support the combat troops, the more support troops are needed to support the support troops. The result is finance center east, where platoons of troops wait to be paid by a battalion of clerks and their companies of Vietnamese secretaries. But the real war can be found at Long Binh. The 2 evacuation hospitals bring in the day's collection of sick and wounded and dead from the field. This is Long Binh's most important support role, and it functions quickly, quietly, and efficiently. The 24th Evacuation Hospital is next to one of the 4 football fields. The 24th specializes in head wounds and neurosurgery.
Right now we're having a football season going on, and there are so many people are involved with it that we're having a hard time scheduling enough fields and people to referee these games.
Captain Edward Moore of Martinsville, Virginia, is Long Bin's operations officer.
Well, here at Long Bin, we have about the same facilities that you might find at a stateside military installation. We have 8 Olympic-sized swimming pools here at Long Bin. We have ranges for archery, for skeet shooting, for putting and driving. We have a miniature golf course. We also have plans for bowling alleys in the future, and these are programmed and will be completed within the year.
To look after the 27,000 Americans on Long Bin, there are 22,000 Vietnamese who come to work on the base each day. They work as bank clerks, gardeners, massage experts, but mostly as room maids for the men. Simply looking after and transporting the maids requires a support system all of its own. Vietnam and America at war together. Many of the combat companies in Vietnam are 40 men under strength. At Long Bin Post, there are units with as many as 400 men over strength. Of more than 400,000 Americans in Vietnam, in all, only 75,000 men are considered to be combat troops. A disproportionate number of draftees are engaged in direct combat. In the rifle companies, 8 out of 10 men are draftees. Long Bin has a disproportionate number of career officers and NCOs.
Increasingly, as American troops pulled out of Vietnam, the question became, could South Vietnam defend itself? To some American fighting men, that seemed extremely unlikely. As Ed Rabel reported, some Americans were fed up.
First Lieutenant Terry Bleed, combat helicopter pilot, Fox Troop, 4th Air Cavalry, goes home to the United States in about 3 months. If he had a choice, he would go home tomorrow, for Lieutenant Bleed is disillusioned and disappointed. But unlike most other GIs in Vietnam, Lieutenant Bleed has not grown weary of the war, but of the people for whom he is fighting. It is the South Vietnamese soldier in whom Lieutenant Bleed no longer has any faith.
I can't understand the South Vietnamese, I really can't, as far as why they do things the way they do. I don't know if they're just seeing too much war or what, but they just have no desire.
Lieutenant Bleed is one of half a dozen pilots in Fox Troop who fly spotter missions in a light observation helicopter, commonly referred to as the Loach. Throughout the war, the outfit has complained of getting a raw deal, of being bounced around Vietnam, now finding themselves at Lai Kay supporting the Vietnamese. The men of Fox Troop believe that until someone decides the Vietnamese can handle it, they will have to remain in Vietnam. Flying at treetop level, the pilots and their observers look for signs of the enemy. And if they find him, they turn their machines into instruments of death.
Okay, there's a blue shirt on a trail down here. Come on, right. Okay, there, got a stinger. Gotcha. Okay, this is a black pajama little dude running around in here. Didn't see any weapons on him. Hey, Roger, that's fine. I just wish he'd stick his head out one more time. Hopefully we got him.
Unable to find the body and fearful that other enemy soldiers might be hiding in the area, Fox Troop calls for South Vietnamese soldiers to be airlifted into the zone. A landing site is located, and then the Loaches leave to refuel and reload the guns. But Lieutenant Bleed and the other pilots doubt whether the Vietnamese reaction force will ever get there.
They take their little naps in the afternoon, and come mealtime, they're worthless. You can't find them.
What about in the future? Do you see any real conflict developing once most of the Americans move out and you're really dependent much more on the South Vietnamese?
I just hope I'm not here. That's all I can say, because it's going to be a shambles. There are good ARVNs, don't get me wrong. There are some really crack outfits, and we work with one of them, but it's a small outfit. But the rest of them, I don't want any part of it. It's going to be bad. If you can't get the support now, what's it going to be like when there's less and less of us?
For American ground troops in Vietnam, the war is almost over. But for U.S. airmen, the end is nowhere in sight. And for pilots like Terry Bleed, who are fighting for and depending on the South Vietnamese, it is a war they no longer wish to endure. Ed Rabel, CBS News, Khartoum, South Vietnam.
As the war began winding down, at least for American ground troops, problems of discipline and morale became increasingly apparent. And disregard of military authority was becoming widespread, as Gary Shepard reported.
This is Fire Support Base Aries, a small clearing in the jungles of War Zone D, 50 miles northeast of Saigon. Like most other American installations, Fire Base Aries isn't very busy these days. The war is at its lowest level in 5 years, and there just isn't much to do. The big guns, which normally would be firing around the clock if the war were raging, now remain silent most of the day, and the men have a lot of time on their hands. Time for such former luxuries as haircuts and games of volleyball.
All right.
And even occasional live entertainment by the 1st Cavalry Division Band during a leisurely noon-hour lunch break. Time also for a trip to a muddy swimming hole less than 200 yards from the fire base perimeter. But in this case, the trip is more than a mere stroll in the jungle.
What's going to be the cabin?
Most of these soldiers are about to turn on with marijuana.
Orangutan, get your haircut.
Grass is as plentiful in Vietnam as sea rations. One pipeful, which the soldiers call a bowl, can easily take care of 5 or 6 men. Marijuana cigarettes are just as easy to get and just as potent. This man is a medic assigned to the 1st Cavalry Division's 1st Battalion, 12th Cavalry.
This stuff smells pretty strong.
It is. It's really nice stuff over here.
How often do you come down here?
I make it down here maybe twice a day. Sometimes in the morning I'll come down here, sometimes in the afternoon. Then we really get it on in the evening up there at the fire base.
You were telling me about a special way you do it.
Oh, Ralph? Oh, Ralph. Ralph's this shotgun this guy carries. And you empty it out, you stick the bowl in the barrel, blow into the bowl, and when it comes out, you get really stoned. Then, you know, who cares about the war? This war.
You do that very often?
Whenever Vito's around.
Vito is a 20-year-old draftee from Philadelphia. A photographer before he entered the Army, Vito is now a squad leader, responsible for the lives of a dozen men.
What's that you got there?
This is Ralph. This is what they were telling you about, Ralph. This is what, well, we use it for also, you know, killing gooks and all, plus little added pleasures, which we use shotgun, which in our term means
wild chickens. You walk
administer something, I guess.
How does Ralph work?
Well, it's a 12-gauge shotgun. Okay, it works real good. Well, what we basically use it for on the LZ and I guess even out in the field, so if you want to know, is that we use the shotgun from a ball. You know, you just put the ball in the chamber and all. And give me the ball.
You got to blow real hard and it's kind of hot, so what's up?
I don't think this one's going to work. Where's the other one? We got another one around here. Paul, let me borrow that ball from you. I heard this is probably all SIDS and we're getting busted, but I don't care.
Shotgun.
Firebase Aries is not unique. What's happening here is also happening to some extent
at virtually every other American installation in Vietnam. Recent surveys estimate that well over 50% of the soldiers in Vietnam use marijuana.
That's my good buddy, Sam.
Gary Shepard, CBS News, in War Zone D.
Well, that's good.
Oh, that was out of sight.
The drug problem in Vietnam was more than marijuana. At one point, it was estimated that almost 1/3 of American troops were experimenting with opium and heroin. In some cases, addiction led to desertion. Late in the war, Ed Bradley filmed this report.
Since January 1970, 700 American servicemen have deserted in Vietnam. Of that number, 430 either returned voluntarily or were captured. That leaves 270 men still listed as deserters. I talked with 5 of them, all but one a drug addict, and 2 of the men consented to tell their story on camera. Army Specialist 4th Class Roberto DeLeo of Los Angeles, California, and Army Specialist 4th Class Clifton Washington of Norfolk, Virginia. Why did you go AWOL?
Well, I had a problem dealing with drugs, and as you know, they have a urinalysis test here in Vietnam. And when I couldn't report to Camp Alpha clean, as you would say, so I took off for a couple of days to deal with this drug problem, and said, well, maybe afterwards I'll report that I'll be late, sure, but I'll be clean, you know, and I won't have any static.
You took off so that you'd be without drugs for a period of days so you could pass the urinalysis test?
Yes.
And what happened after a few days?
Well, I found myself still lingering on, and then time went by and continued to go by, and I'm still here, you know. I know if I go back, I'll probably get hung, time in jail, and still a bad discharge, you know. So I just wait a while and see what changes.
I was strung out on skag, you know, heroin.
Were you smoking or shooting heroin?
Well, I was smoking at first, and I went down to shooting. Now I'm doing both, smoking and shooting.
You ever think of yourself as a junkie?
Yes, I do. I don't like it a bit, you know, but it's something, well, something that I don't want to do, but my system keeps asking for it, you know. I just don't like it, you know. I'm tired of it, but my system keeps asking for skag, so I just give it to it.
Have you ever been stopped by MPs here?
Yes, I've been stopped by MPs.
And what happens then?
Well, they couldn't prove that I was AWOL, so they had to let me go, you know.
Is it difficult to get false civilian ID papers here?
No, it's not. It's very easy, really. I have papers myself, you know, and like, that's what keeps me here in Vietnam without being hassled or anything, you know.
So if MPs stop you, you have phony ID cards to show them?
Right.
Can you get into the PX to purchase goods with those ID cards?
Yes, you can.
Is that a way of making a living here?
Yes, really.
How do you go about that? Explain that to me.
Well, like, you would purchase the items that you want to buy, and then whatever you purchase, you know, you could bring it downtown and you could sell it to the Vietnamese, you know. I said, like, beer, cigarettes, so on, you know. It carries a pretty good profit on the black market, so where there would be a means of income, you know, to survive, you know.
Do most of the guys who are AWOL make money that way?
Yes.
They were part of the tragedy, American soldiers who wasted themselves on drugs. But they were only part of the tragedy. Vietnam became a mosaic of heartbreaks, sometimes life, sometimes limb, as Morton Dean reported.
John and Tra have been friends for a long time. They are both 11 years old and were living in the village of Binh Duc, doing the things that young country girls do in Vietnam, playing together, working together, children of poor parents. Now they suffer and hope together. The report at the Quaker Rehabilitation Center reads, on February 19th, 1971, at 5 o'clock in the morning, the 2 girls and 2 other friends left their village to go to market to sell wood. While they were walking along the road, a South Vietnamese soldier heard their voices, thought they were the enemy, and detonated a mine. Reports that the war has wound down may seem fanciful to those who crowd the hospital wards. In the first 3 months of this year, the latest period for which statistics were made available to CBS News, more than 10,000 civilians were wounded and hospitalized. The making of prosthetic devices, artificial limbs, of necessity, has become an important industry in this country. U.S. officials believe newly trained technicians in South Vietnam turn out more artificial limbs per man-hour of work than in any nation at any time in history. Even so, the benches are crowded. The need overwhelms the availability of artificial limbs, and many patients must wait before they will walk again. Mrs. Errol Kubica, wife of the center's director, is a physical therapist with 4 years' experience in Vietnam. What will happen, do you think, to Tra and Chan, 2 little girls we've seen here?
Chan will probably be fine because she has just one leg below the knee, lost one leg below the knee. So I think she'll just lead a fairly normal life, be able to go to market and do all the things that that she would expect to do. The sad thing may be that her marriage prospects may be affected by being a disabled person. And that, of course, will be sad for her when she's older. The other little one will have a much harder time. Walking for her will always be difficult. She should walk almost normally, but she won't be able to walk very far. And so she'll manage all right, but she won't do as well as Chan.
The peace talks in Paris continued. The secret talks between Kissinger and North Vietnam continued. But in 1972, the communists launched another offensive, storming into the northern provinces of South Vietnam. Nixon responded with force.
In full coordination with the Republic of Vietnam, I have ordered the following measures, which are being implemented as I am speaking to you. All entrances to North Vietnamese ports will be mined to prevent access to these ports and North Vietnamese naval operations from these ports. United States forces have been directed to take appropriate measures within the internal and claimed territorial waters of North Vietnam to interdict the delivery of any supplies.
The spring offensive of 1972 was the first acid test of President Nixon's policy. Could the troops of South Vietnam fight and win? The first results were not encouraging. A key communist target was the city of Quang Tri. Here, the result was something of a disaster, as Bob Simon reported.
For 4 days, rockets rained down on Quang Tri's military headquarters almost every hour on the hour, 24 hours a day. By Sunday afternoon, the city's only airfield was in a shambles, and the American advisors decided to get out. 150 American soldiers assigned to advise and assist the South Vietnamese 3rd Division set fire to their compound and evacuated to the south. Officers complained they could no longer help their Vietnamese counterparts, and there was virtually nothing between their compound and the communists to the north. In 3 days, the McNamara line had been obliterated. The string of fire bases and outposts between Quang Tri City and the DMZ no longer exists. By Sunday afternoon, the communists were just outside the city of Dong Ha. The road between Dong Ha and Quang Tri to the south was a river of refugees. For 8 solid miles, thousands upon thousands, with their cattle, their children, their fear. The fortunate traveled in families. Many were alone. This boy doesn't know where his parents are. They told him to leave the village, that they'd meet him somewhere along the way. People don't understand what's happened. The Americans, they say, were supposed to protect us. Many are convinced a deal has been made between Hanoi and Washington, a deal giving the communists their homes. But they never really believed the Americans would ever let this happen. Passing soldiers donate bags of rice, a gift from the province chief. No one knows when the next meal will be offered. They will spend the night in Quang Tri City, most of them on the streets, the lucky few in makeshift government shelters. Meanwhile, many residents of Quang Tri are fleeing further south to Hue and beyond. They may not be able to do it much longer. The communists are trying to cut the road. In Quang Tri province today, the most valuable commodity is a motorcycle or a bicycle. The South Vietnamese army knew this day was coming, the day without Americans. It was to be the big test, both for them and for President Nixon's Vietnamization program. The results in so far are not encouraging. Whole battalions of the government's 3rd Division joined the refugees on the road south. They had been outnumbered, overpowered, overwhelmed. The soldiers complain about the lack of air support. The Air Force complains about the weather. The big questions now are what happens when the weather clears and what in fact are the communist objectives. But on one point, high-ranking officers, American and South Vietnamese, are agreed. This time, the North Vietnamese are not fooling around. This is the offensive everyone's been waiting for. Bob Simon, CBS News, on the road to Quang Tri.
American air power blunted the force of the communist offensive, and some units from South Vietnam fought both bravely and well. The offensive finally was turned back, but only at a terrible price. Again, a report from Bob Simon.
The situation in Quang Tri province is stabilized. The enemy has been contained. American advisors and South Vietnamese officers have been saying that for the past 2 weeks. But someone forgot to tell the North Vietnamese. Much of the day's fighting is left to the regional forces, the local people's militia. The communists blocking the road are dug into the wastelands just south of Quang Tri, sand dunes which stretch endlessly miles from the ocean. The North Vietnamese bunkers are less than 50 feet away. The regional forces use grenade launchers, mortar, M16s. The communists answer with AK-47s, machine guns, and more grenades. It's impossible to tell at any moment whether the fire in the air and the explosions on the ground are coming from one side or the other. Sometimes a soldier appears in a strange place a bit distant from the battle. We don't know what side he's on. That's Vietnamization. Everybody looks alike. The ranking South Vietnamese officer quickly decides the communists have been flushed out. He urges his men forward to finish them off. The decision is premature. The officer is the first to fall, an AK round in the chest. Then another man goes down, another chest wound. An American helicopter approaches on its way to Quang Tri. The pilot quickly changes his mind. Vietnamization means very few helicopters to evacuate the wounded. The men will wait for a jeep. A bit up the road, an armored car with ammunition for the troops is hit by a communist rocket. The South Vietnamese are isolated. The North Vietnamese are also alone. A few men get cocky, run forward, throw grenades into bunkers, hit the dirt, run back with prizes. AK-47s and rocket launchers. Then what everyone had been waiting for, a North Vietnamese soldier in the open, on the run. The men open up with everything they have. From the amount of fire coming at them, government troops had thought they were facing at least a company of North Vietnamese regulars. It turns out to be just a couple of platoons on another suicide mission. One by one, the men blow up the bunkers with hand grenades. They examine the bodies and sift through the belongings. There's a wounded soldier in one of the bunkers, but the men are in no mood to take prisoners. Up the road, civilians sense that the fighting is over, that the road is open. They come racing down on motorcycles and trucks. Another premature decision. AK fire rings out from a distant bunker. And the communists still have another surprise. The road is mined. It's mined to prevent tanks from coming down, but mines are not very discriminate. A truckload of refugees goes up in smoke. Women, children, babies. Some are dead, some are not dead. By evening, government spokesmen are saying another grand victory has been won in Quang Tri province. The situation is once again stabilized. But there will be more fighting and more words. Words spoken by generals, journalists, politicians. But here on Route 1, it's difficult to imagine what those words can be. There's nothing left to say about this war. There's just nothing left to say. Bob Simon, CBS News, Route 1.
The war, as always, could be reported in numbers. So many dead, so many wounded. But they weren't really numbers. They were people. And as the Americans pulled out, the victims were increasingly Vietnamese. Their pain was equivalent to our pain. A son or brother or friend lost in war, a pain for which there was no cure. Consider this report from Richard Threlkeld.
It happens every day. The South Vietnamese army tells the world press how the war is going. So many victories, so many wounded, so many dead. Facts and figures. But there is no way to measure how much this war has cost Vietnam in human suffering. In the funeral shops in Saigon these days, the wreaths are made of plastic. There are too many funerals and not enough flowers. No way to measure how much of South Vietnam's future has been lost on the battlefield. How many poets and politicians are among the corporals and sergeants and captains waiting to be buried? These days, in the cemeteries, there are too many coffins and not enough grave diggers. In a Saigon pagoda, the soul of Lieutenant Nguyen Van Phuc is committed to Buddha's eternal care. The war ended for Lieutenant Phuc 2 days ago along the Cambodian border in one of those nameless little battles that never make the headlines. He was 24 years old. Everyone is here, his family, his friends, his military comrades, the girl he was going to marry. In a way, Lieutenant Phuc was lucky. He was an officer, and his family is moderately wealthy, so he rates the best. He has his medals, the gifts of food and drink to sustain him in the afterlife, the tears of those who knew and loved him. And a military escort en route to the cemetery. After this is all over, Lieutenant Phuc's family will be compensated by the government. 1 year's salary, $500. A small price for a lifetime of memories. Memories that began in Hanoi in 1950. Nguyen Phuc's parents were killed in the war, so his uncle adopted him. There were 8 children, but Phuc was the favorite, happy and precocious. They moved to this house in Saigon when Phuc was 7. Phuc grew straight and tall. He was a Boy Scout, the pride of the family. There were weekends at the zoo, summers on the beach at Vung Tau. Fook spent a lot of his time at the music stores with all the other teenagers. He loved music and played a good guitar. He and his pals buzzed around Saigon on their motorbikes, flirting with the girls. Happy, carefree days, and Fook was the happiest, the most carefree of them all. Fook graduated with honors from this high school. He was good in debate, a talented poet, and quite a ladies' man. He was going to the university, but the draft came along. Then the Tuduk Military Academy, a reserve officer, his unit called up, an officer's commission in the elite Rangers, and finally called to combat. And then his family learned Nguyen Phuc was dead. The youngest son, Nam, is 18. He has just been drafted. A week ago, he says, Phuc wrote me and said he was coming home and we would play together as we did when we were young. Now, I must go take his place. So, Nguyen Van Phuc, poet, musician, soldier, is buried. In a few moments, the military escort will march away to another funeral, and Phuc's family will dry their tears and resume their lives. In Lieutenant Phuc's personal effects, there was a diary. In it, written in his own hand, was this passage from Ernest Hemingway's Farewell to Arms. Why are you afraid of the rain? I don't know. Tell me, don't make me. Tell me. All right, I am afraid of the rain because sometimes I see myself dead in it. Richard Threlkeld, CBS News, in a cemetery near Saigon.
4 years of peace talks, secret and public, had been dragging on in Paris. Sometimes there appeared to be progress. Sometimes there was deadlock. But on October 26, 1972, shortly before the presidential election in the United States, Henry Kissinger issued an electrifying announcement.
We believe that peace is at hand. We believe that an agreement is within sight. What remains to be done can be settled in one more negotiating session with the North Vietnamese negotiators, lasting, I would think, no more than 3 or 4 days. So we are not talking of a delay of a very long period of time.
As it turned out, Kissinger was premature. The peace agreement was not signed until 3 months later, and then only after the recently re-elected President Nixon had ordered the heaviest bombing raids of the war, the so-called Christmas bombing of Vietnam. But on January 27, 1973, the ceasefire agreements were signed in Paris. American troops would leave Vietnam. American prisoners of war would be released. President Nixon coined a phrase to describe what had been accomplished.
I have asked for this radio and television time tonight for the purpose of announcing that we today have concluded an agreement to end the war and bring peace with honor in Vietnam and in Southeast Asia.
Peace with honor, the president said. But was it really peace, and was it with honor? Those questions could not yet be answered. The fact is, the Vietnam War was not over. It would reignite, and the final bloody chapters were yet to be written. This is Walter Cronkite, and this has been another in our continuing series of video cassettes on the Vietnam War.